Hello, and yeah, thank you for your interest in my script. I figured it might need a tutorial because at this point it's just a bit over-engineered. So I hope I'll get you a bit of a feel of how to use it and in best case make your Reaper life a bit simpler with that. So first of all, to be able to use my unique regions script or the script bundle, you first of all need to install the Lacasana GUI library from Rescript. You use the GUI. Then I have one script which provides me with additional utilities. You need to download that as well, or you can just download my whole script bundle, and then obviously the unique regions script itself. So we'll start off with a bit of a simpler setup first and then increase it bit for bit, so hopefully you'll get along. First of all, I will start with a really simple setup in the tab settings to explain each of the controls here. So for that, I'll create a few MIDI items which are empty just to underline the intentional purpose, but without any audio material, just to show you what it's doing. So with the create button, we can simply toggle whether or not we want to create the region for which we'll set up rules in the following steps. That might be useful if you have multiple tabs of those region rules later on and decide for one specific purpose you don't want to use that tab and can just toggle it on and off. Then the next one is over how many of the selected items you want your regions to be created. So for example, if I want one region over each of those items, I'll just stick with the one here. If I'll say my region should span over 2 of those items, I'll put in 2. And if I simply want one region over all of the items, you can use a 0. Just as a notice in the beginning, each time you hover over any of those input options, you get a small tooltip, which normally should help you get along if there's something gets lost in my bit broken English, maybe. Yeah. For this scenario, we'll start with a 1 and stick with that. For the region name, for now, I'll simply put in test, and that will result in each region being named test. As I'm already talking about regions, you can choose whether it should be a region or a marker which gets created. That will be useful in later, more complex setups that we might want to use markers as well. Then this color button opens up the Reaper native color picker, which just looks like this on Windows. Yeah, I can choose pink for now, and then the color will change to the corresponding color. And if I close the dialog without picking a color, defaults back to your normal region color. Yeah, I'll choose pink for now. The link to the RRM, the region render matrix, will be useful a bit, or might be useful if we have a bit of an advanced setting. For now, again, I'll stick with master as that might be useful for the most cases. Then, to simply demonstrate what we've got going on by now, we have a region per item. Each of them is named test and it's colored pink. Perfect. As you noticed, I already turned off some other settings down here. We'll get to those in a bit. Yeah, so as a next step, we have the region marker length offset as well. That might be useful if you have some reverb or any other effects which should be included in the region but are longer than the item length itself. So again, very specific use cases, but you might find it useful to being able to extend your region for example, a second, or if you find that the whole length of the slider is not enough for your use cases, which are already 10 seconds, which should normally be enough, you can simply type it in here as well, and that will extend the slide. Same for the other direction, but to be fair, normally there isn't really a use case to have the region starting earlier than your actual item, only if the plugins you're using are being turned off or something and they need to buffer in advance a bit. That might be useful to, I don't know, only use like 0.1 or something, so the region has a slight offset at the beginning, and as well that can be useful if you are using the regions only for visual purposes. So for example, if you have a region overspanning all of your items, you might want it to be a little bigger than the actual items for each individual item. Cool. I'll go with, I don't know, half a second for now, and as well quickly demonstrate if I put in every 2 items and run it now. We see that the regions are overspanning 2 items and extend half a second after the last item. By now, you're probably still wondering why you should even use that script. The main interesting part of it is actually the different naming options and naming wildcards included in that. For further information about the wildcards, you can press wildcards and wildcard info and get an additional window with which will hopefully explain all the wildcard setting, which I'm explaining right now as well if you need to check on something again. So first interesting one is probably the /e for enumerate, which simply numbers our regions. So normal use case of, for example, you are creating variation files for a video game or something and want your regions to be numbered. You then type in /e and the number you want your numbering to start from. So for example, that could be 1, and if I turn it back to single item, select all of those, run. Those are now numbered 0, 1, 0, 2, and so on. The 0 at the beginning might look surprising at first because we didn't type that in specifically, but under the wildcards tab you have the option to change the amount of leading zeros for /e. So defaults to 2 digits. So in a scenario where you might have up to 20 variation files, you want your first to have that 0, 1, so it doesn't mess with your numbering in your file explorer or whatsoever. But we can even extend that up to 4 digits or simply turn it off. For all further wildcards as well, this can be combined with any other text input which we'd like. So if, for example, we are talking about sample instrument creation and we are using, I don't know, violin recordings, and we are having round robins, I can simply type in RR and then the /e numbering, and that will name all the regions RR1, RR2, RR3, and so on. Just as quick addition as well, the /e as well allows for the use of the modulo operator. So you type in the %sign and the number you want to modulo on. So I don't know, for example, 2, and that as well can have an offset. So modulo normally goes down to 0, so that would be 0, 1, 0, 1, and so on. But if I say +1, and obviously want it to start from 1, then that would leave me with round robins being named RR1, RR2, and then RR1 again. Wonderful. As we're already talking about sample instrument creation, and with all that connected, you probably stumbled upon the problem of how your regions or items which you render out can be named after the MIDI items, no, the MIDI nodes you're actually referring to. So I included a /m wildcard, in which in the brackets you can type in the node you want to start from. So that could be, for our example, simply, I don't know, C1. And to demonstrate that as well, I'll switch to markers. And now if I select all of those, press run, we have markers being named C1, C#1, D1, and so on. That obviously, but that works as well if we increase the octave we're talking about. So I'm duplicating the items a few times. And if I press run now, at some point we reach C2 and so on. For some sample instruments, you might haven't sampled each individual note. So there's as well the option to use a so-called Stepsize. So for that, you type in the node you want to start on, and then colon. I'm still in the Reaper window. Colon, for example, 3 to increase the note in minor thirds. Again, I'm selecting all the nodes, pressing run, and then the markers are now named C1, E#1, F#1, and so on. And as last wildcard, which I want to present in this short video, which is already taking up way too much time, we have /C. /C stands for custom wildcards, as you are able to set up custom wildcard tables under wildcards and, for example, table 1. If we stick to our example of working with sample instruments, we might want to use a velocity range. So I could type in 0 to 63 or something as a next cycle, or we can use even smaller step sizes, 32, 33 to 64, 64 to 7, 27, for example. I then press save, and if I want to refer to the first table I just set up, I type in /C bracket 1. Again, selecting all of the items, creating markers in the color pink, and if I press run now, all those markers get those names which we just typed in the table, which get separated by a new line. So we have markers being named 0 to 32, 33 to 64, and so on, until we reach the last entry. Then we go back to the first. So I hope that's even visible on the screen recording, but our fifth marker is again named 0 to 32. Now, to even dive a bit deeper in the options of the script, it as well allows to refer to items being spread across multiple tracks. So that could be, for example, sample instruments we recorded with different mic positions, or if we're talking about sound designs, your different layers of different tracks. So for this example, I just grouped those, and I don't know, let's name that our mic positions, and those would start at the same time. So if, again, we create those regions, that simply works as expected with both regions and markers over both of the items. If we now would, for example, offset the lower track items to the upper track items, all overlapping selected items still are being measured as one overlapping item group in the script. So an imaginable use case could again be for sample instrument recording the tail of an instrument, which you cut off of a different region, or as well for sound design purpose creation, you have multiple layers at different starts of your overall sound design. Now I'll decrease the time after of the region. You'll see that the region starts from the very first item start to the end of the last item, which overlap. So now you see that that might result in some weird spacing of the regions, which is why under other settings, we have this small toggle here. This allows us to reposition the items so we have a fixed distance between each of them. That is partly comparable to the reposition item script of SWS, which as well is great, but somewhat behaves weird if you're thinking of each track as being connected to the one below. So I simply included that in my script as well. And if we type in, we want our items to be 5 seconds apart, you now see that each of the region is spaced accordingly. The other setting we have down here is the so-called group tolerance. This is, again, maybe somewhat specific, but in a scenario where we might have layers of a sound which actually don't overlap. So for this very first thing, I'll create a new media item and say that starts over here. Again, if you're, for example, working with a lot of reverb and there's reverb shimmering out from the start of the item and then there's a second thing starting, you might still want to use the script, but that would think that is its own region down here. So using it normally, that would result in this. But as we don't want that, we have this slider group tolerance. Normally, as I said, items have to overlap each other. Doesn't matter if they're on the same track or not, to be counted as one item, overlapping item group. I'm a bit careful with the term item group because Reaper has item groups as well, so I don't want to overly confuse you guys. Yes, so in this example, our second part of our sound is half a second apart. So if I want to tell the script that that's still one sound, I have to put the group tolerance larger than our distance. So example 0.6. Now if I select all my items again, script, we see that as I spaced my items weirdly, sadly, that happened on a few ones, but all those are now counted as one sound. Again, that's probably a very specific use case, and if you don't need that feature, you're probably the safest if you stick to 0, so something like this doesn't happen where later variations of your sound, which are a bit closer together, don't count in one region. Cool, and now as one of the last settings on this main page, we have the isolate options. So in a scenario where your session might be a bit more busy than my freshly created one here, and you have a second track which you actually don't want to include in your other regions, that might cause problems in your script if you're actually repositioning the items. So specifically, I'm talking about problems that the script looks where is each overlapping item group starting and where obviously is it ending as well. And if there are other items spread across your sessions on other tracks, that might result in some difficulties. And as well, if you have other items down here and you still choose not to reposition your items, but have the region random matrix link set to your master track, you would include those other tracks down here, obviously, as well. So for that, if I want only those items to be included in my regions, I have the different options down here. So that's either move selected, move the other non-selected items, or don't move the item. So if we take a look for the move selected variation, that moves the selected items at the end of those overlapping items, and then, as we saw it before, spaces the regions. And now lastly, we'll dive a bit into the RRM options, because we do have quite a few of those. So I'll go back to our previous version about the regions and look at the option. We just had master before, so to quickly show you that it works as intended, I'll open the region random matrix, and you'll see that each region now has the link to the master track. Sometimes that might not be what we want, and we want to have a bit more control. So we'll start from the bottom. There's obviously as well the option to use non-link to the region random matrix if the regions we create are just intended to be visual. The next option is each track. That has to be said that only tracks where an actual item is will have a region random matrix link. So our track down here, which is now named additional item, will only have the link to the region random matrix for this very first region. Next option now is the parent per item. Why it says per item is important for if we check in the next sections. So if I group our additional item track in another track, this again is probably only happening in very complex sound design sessions. Then run the script, you'll see that the first regions will have the link to the mic position track over here, and for our additional item track, it will have the link to the parent track. So I won't make an example for each individual possible selection in the link to the RRM option, but to quickly underline the differences between first common parent and highest common parent is that first common parent checks which is the first parent which all of the selected items do have in common. So I just created more parent or folder tracks for the selected items. We have the mic position parent track, a parent track for the additional item, then the first parent track for all of those, and the parent 2, which is again a higher parent for all of those again. So the first common parent will create a link to parent 1, as that is our first common parent of all those overlapping items, and highest common parent for parent 2. If we now, for example, would include those items down here, we wouldn't have a common parent at all, as this track is totally separate folder structure than the other items. If we then run any of the first or highest common parent options for the region random matrix, that will link us to the master track, as that can be viewed as a parent track as well. But again, I have to underline that that is computed for each individual overlapping item group. Wonderful. That is now everything regarding the region random matrix link for now. To quickly underline the options we have up here. First of all, we have the file settings, which allows us to initialize all changes we made over here. So, for example, I changed that to marker and the name to test. The moment I press new/initialize, I get a small warning if I'm really sure about resetting. And if I press yes, I go back to the default setting. Again, I have the options to say the current setting I set up should be saved as default, so the next time you open the script, or as well run my action of unique regions with the defaults option, it will refer to your defaults being set over that dialog. Then as well, we have the option to export to clipboard and to file and import that from the clipboard or from the file. That might be useful if you have multiple setups for my script, which, for example, differ for sound design setups and sample editing, or you're working in a bigger team and want to share the setups of script members. So to quickly demonstrate that, I'll just name the region test, set it to marker, just the time, and then say export to clipboard. You can then see my clipboard up here. This is just like is a CSV type string, which gets copied to your clipboard. Same for the file. Reset over the initialize dialog. And then import from clipboard. We have all the settings we previously saved to our. The next options on the wildcard, we mostly talked about those. The very first one are the custom tables for the custom wildcard settings accessible over /C. And we have the leading 0 option for /E and the wildcard info tab, which just summarizes everything I tried to explain in this video. Then under other, we have some minor additional settings. First being preview time settings with time selection. So to quickly demonstrate that, if I select those items, set that to region and turn on preview with time selection, you see the time selection changing when I move this slider. So especially if you have multiple items selected and want to make sure how long is my actual region, which I'll create, you'll sort of get an impression with the preview. With the time selection feature, you just have to keep in mind that if you reposition the items, the region will like stop here, but the next item will then be moved further away. The next is lock items after execution. So if I simply run the script once, you'll notice that those items included in my regions are now locked. That might be useful if you're a bit unsure whether all your other actions probably might interfere with the settings you created for those items and the region, and you want to make sure you're not moving the items out of the region. And lastly, that one is pretty obviously, close the GUI after execution. So I press Command that once, turn off that moving thing, and if I press run, the GUI disappears and closes itself. That, by the way, can be saved in your default settings as well, as all those are written your default. Lastly, I have a small shortcut list under help. If you somewhat get to the point where you even want to optimize your workflow in my script. So those are mostly all of the features in my script, but I missed out on one very important one, as main idea of my script is that you're able to combine multiple of those region sets we just talked about and create your custom naming with that. So that small plus over here, I create a new tab, and this can have its very own settings for its region. So for example, for here, I can use /E starting from 1, and for my first tab, I'll set it to every third item and use /M starting from C1 with a step size of 2. So if we now look into that, I'll simply select the item up here. We will have an individual region for each overlapping item group, and over every 3 item groups, an additional region with a media name. I'll turn off repositioning for now, and we'll look. As you can see, The top region is named C1, the next one D1, as we have the step size of 2, and so on. And each sub-region has this numbering starting from 0, 1, then 0, 2, 0, 3, and then 0, 4, and so on. You'll probably already think that in a use case like this, if we're thinking of sample instrument creation again and talking about round robins, we want that to reset every time we have a new MIDI node. So for that, I'll use the Modulo operator and 2, and so that our numbering is starting from 1. Oh, no, sorry. I want that to be 3 because we have 3 items per group, and then offset it by 1 because we want our items to be named 1, 2, 3 and not 0, 1, 2. That will following regions: RRO1, RRO2, RRO3, and then again RRO1, RRO2, and so on. Yeah. And this is now the point where you can get creative or adapt all that to your personal use case. So as I mentioned before, you might want to use the custom wildcard table for your velocity range, which is like a smaller region group let's say every 3. Then we have every 9 items a new MIDI node. For that, I'll use a marker. The marker should be pink. My round robins should be greenish, and my velocity range can be, I don't know, reddish. As I restarted the script, I quickly have to type in our velocity ranges again. So that was like 0 to 43, 44 to 7, and then 8, 7. Those are not ideal velocity ranges, but I hope you'll sort of get the idea. Perfect. Move that for a second. And yeah, I might want my velocity ranges to be markers as well. So I'll stick with regions for now. Perfect. You can now see we have a marker for each MIDI node, then the velocity ranges, and then round robins for each velocity. This is just a very constructed example for now, but I do think there are many use cases where your naming might even be more complex and you'll need even more of those tabs. But to maybe point out the options of Reaper and Reaper's rendering, one very important option I didn't mention is that you can use, I don't even know how Reaper calls it, there are export wildcards and you have the option to refer to $region and then in brackets name. So to make an example, I could say MIDI that, word that, RR that, and val for velocity that. I'll duplicate the items a few times, so you'll even see everything is going on full range. So all of them, hopefully. Perfect. And I'll offset that marker visually a bit so you know what's going on. And I want my regions to be spaced 2 seconds apart. Velocity like half a second at the beginning and half a second at. Cool. Then I'll create all those regions, which now are a lot because I duplicated the items. But the magic of Reaper really happens now. If I switch to region random matrix, like all those regions being linked to the master, which, yeah, maybe for the velocity range, we would turn that off. So we do that quick, that region run. Again, if that link now is missing. And now I can type in $region with the name of our, I think you would normally start off with a MIDI node first. So MIDI underscore region, then be using the velocity range, and then underscore $region and RR. As you can already see in the preview, that gives us a pretty good name already. Because, oh, our first MIDI thing isn't a region, but a marker. That now gives us perfectly usable naming for Kontakt or whatever other sampling software you might be using. So in this example, we have C1 underscore velocity range underscore the round robins, and that being done for all those regions we are using. If I now include, I don't know, if we recorded violin, legato, or even the legato could be in the same session being accessed over /C2, for example. And we have like playing techniques in our next custom wildcard table. But for now, I could export all of those files, which are either mic position, mix combinations, or yeah, the initial bowing and the tail, or whatsoever, directly as files. And we could even go a bit further. If we now go back to our idea of having all of those tracks as mic positions, so for example, AB and XY, or it could be far and close, whatsoever, I would switch the link to RRM to master, but to track, and then press run. That will leave us with the random matrix like this. And if I would then include, for example, at the beginning with $track underscore empty tracks, in this example, AB and XY, that gives us the wonderful, perfectly usable name, violin legato underscore AB underscore C1 underscore 0 to 43 as velocity range underscore round robin 01. Cool. As that video is now spanning over half an hour, that really underlines that my script is probably a bit over-engineered, but I do hope and think that it might be useful for some of you. And yeah, if you find it useful, I'm very happy to share. You'll find all the links to my repository and the ones I'm referring to at the beginning of the video down in the video description. And yeah, I hope you have a wonderful day, evening, night, and hopefully not a too heavy crunch time in whichever project you're currently in. Bye.